Good morning to you all. Good evening to some of the panelists. I know that Shivshankar Menon is joining us from Singapore, so it's I think 9 p.m. In Singapore, 12-hour difference. Very grateful for this late evening contribution of Ambassador Menon. In the room on my left, you have Karin Landgren, who is the Executive Director of the Security Council report, and Comfort Aero, who is the President and CEO of ICG, International Crisis Group. I'm very happy to have both of you here in person. On the screen, you see Shivshankar Menon, and you see also Professor Thomas Biersteker, who is joining us from Geneva. And we should have Funmi Olonisakin joining us. Oh, what? And joining us from London, and Muta Kent is also joining this panel. So yesterday, in our first panel in the morning, we got, let's be honest, somewhat bleak picture of the international situation, a sense that the realist school is back with a harsher world, a more polarized world, not a bipolar world, but a world with multiple poles and not much common ground. I think it's our Chinese colleague, Dr. Jia, who said it's a no-war peace. Meaning that, yes, there is a kind of peace. The panelists did not expect a war between the major global powers, but that peace is very thin. And so that's the geopolitical background in which we are operating. And in that background, states have assumed a central place, in the sense that we had in the last 2 or 3 decades that civil society, that from a bottom up, people could take control. That is somewhat diminished. Although we heard yesterday afternoon in the session on the Golden Triangle that indeed when there are benevolent business leaders, there can be a very positive interaction between business, civil society, and public institutions. But even that interaction has its own limits. I mean, it's not going to stop the war in Ukraine. It did not prevent the war in Ukraine. So the purpose really of this panel this morning is to look at, in that bleak picture, we cannot give up. I mean, your profession is to be, you're all diplomats. And so you have to think of what is the toolkit in that situation. How do we, I said yesterday I was a sailor, how do we tack against those headwinds so that we continue to make some progress, even if maybe the ambitions of a more unified world are gone. I will start with Karin Landgren. She has direct experience of what the United Nations operational role in peace and security is. She led 3 peace operations. I think she is the only woman in the history of the United Nations to have done that, and it's a tribute to remarkable qualities. And now she is the director, the executive director of, as I said, of the Security Council report, which is a very focused organization, extremely useful one, which makes sure, I would say, that it's not just the P5 who know what's going on in the Security Council, it's the whole membership of the UN. And that's very important in sort of shifting a bit the power by having this close look at the Security Council. So, Karin, you are in a very good position, in the best position to give us an assessment of the role of the UN in this field of peace and security. Not the whole the UN does many other things than peace and security, but today we are discussing peace and security. And so this is Chatham Rules. If you had to give a report card of the UN Security Council today, what would you say, and what does it tell us about multilateralism more broadly?
Thanks, Jean-Marie, and I'm very happy to be part of this panel in excellent company with these great analysts. I would say that right now there's an enormous gulf between many governments' stated commitments and their practices, and that includes Security Council members. The hostility of some states to UN Charter principles has become more obvious, more transparent. I think we could say that the gloves have come off in many cases. And this is combined with what I believe is going to be a significant global decoupling around strategic commodities that will have its own dynamic over time, not a reinforcing dynamic. But before saying more about the state of the Security Council, I want to offer a perspective on Ukraine and the Council, because Ukraine is defining so much of the West's take on what is working in the UN and what isn't. Certainly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the related mass displacement, destruction, and the killing of civilians spotlights the Council's inability to prevent the very things that it was set up in order to prevent. And Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons is a reminder of how badly international arms control regimes have been degraded over the past decades. President Zelensky and many others have claimed that Ukraine shows just why the Security Council needs to be reformed. But I would say in response, we should consider which mechanisms or what kind of structures we think would have prevented Russia from invading Ukraine. And reflecting on that honestly, if the answer is actually none of our collective mechanisms, not the Security Council, not other UN, not other regional, could have peacefully prevented that invasion, then I think that is an important reminder that even the UN Charter acknowledges that peaceful mechanisms are not the only answer. As the Charter says, nothing in it impairs the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense in the event of attack. So I just want to put that out there as something to keep in mind in this conversation, that although Ukraine has been a prime springboard for discussions of change, reform, toolkits, Ukraine is perhaps not the best test for Security Council effectiveness, going out on a bit of a limb here. So Ukraine 2022 has certainly made the tough geopolitics even harder, but the problems facing peaceful multilateralism didn't start with Ukraine. So setting aside Ukraine for a moment, let me mention some other trends in the Council, and I'm afraid they are negative trends in case you thought I was going to counter yesterday's bleak assessment. Not really. One is the many states, including Council members and several middle powers, that are actively intervening in conflicts and fragile situations via mercenaries, via armaments, via nefarious cyber activity, sometimes even via conventional military engagement, but outside the realms of the Security Council. And these are interventions that often violate Security Council resolutions. They prolong conflicts, and some are in countries hosting UN peace operations, where they severely complicate the life of the peace operation and the relationship between the UN and the host government. One of the tools that's being eroded from peacekeeping and from conflict resolution is, quote, collective coherence behind a political strategy, which is part of A4P+, which many of you will be familiar with, Action for Peacekeeping Plus. This erosion of coherent political strategies, which is so much of what we want from the Security Council and from the UN Secretariat, which I'll come back to, extends to the realm of UN sanctions, where Council agreement is often very shaky and there's widespread sanctions breaking. I'm sure Thomas will say more about this. But that is a prime tool that is really not working optimally. Despite an effort in the Security Council by many members to compartmentalize Ukraine and not have those tensions bleed over into everything else, just about every Security Council resolution is now a challenging negotiation. And in recent months, several peace operations have had shorter rollovers, as they tend to be called, in place of their habitual extensions. And there have been times when permanent members have reportedly simply refused to engage in negotiation over council resolutions. Now, there was only one veto last year in the council, but I really want to underline that vetoes are not a very useful metric either when we look at Security Council effectiveness. At the same time, and this is the last negative I'll mention, there's a real effort by member states to keep many country and thematic issues off the Council's agenda, sometimes using the argument that they are better dealt with by regional organizations. In 2020, I suggested to Council members that their, in effect, blackout list of items was rapidly becoming as long as their actual list of agenda items. And that is a problem when there are so many things that the Security Council just will not or cannot discuss. So many issues strongly pertaining to international peace and security. So there are so many reminders that the Security Council is deeply imperfect and that permanent members in particular are failing their commitments and their obligations to the Council, that it can be really hard to keep faith in the idea that the UN can save generations from the scourge of war and from war's untold sorrow to mankind, as the Council rightly puts it. But although I share a somewhat bleak assessment of where things stand, I do want to remind us that we are not anywhere near rock bottom in terms of disunity and conflict. And for that reason, it's especially essential now to keep some faith in the idea of a rules-based order and to take stronger measures to protect it and develop it.
Thank you very much, Karin, for this assessment where at the end you give us some hope because you say it could get much worse.
Right.
So let's keep that in mind and we'll explore, how to get it better. Before giving the floor to Shivshankar Menon, I would like to give the floor to Muhtar Kent, who has kindly joined us this morning. Muhtar, over to you.
Jean-Marie, thank you. My only purpose is to seek a minute is to just thank all the panelists, the very rich panelists that are joining us today. We just heard from Karin Landgren and then also Professor Biersteker and Comfort Ero and Secretary Menon and Funmi Olonisakin. I just want to thank you on behalf of myself and my family. We are very proud to set up this program at Columbia's SIPA school, and it's and very amazingly the program gets richer every year, and with all of you contributing so measurably to the program. So once again, thanks for agreeing to be part of this program for 2022. We appreciate that very much with the Columbia's SIPA school. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Muhtar. Now I'm going to turn to Shivshankar Menon, very distinguished diplomat from India. You have been the ambassador of your country in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in China, in Israel. So you've been in very sensitive positions abroad, and you've also been the Foreign Secretary and the National Security Advisor of India. And so having occupied all those really very sensitive positions in diplomacy, I'm tempted to ask you, how do we make sure that diplomacy does not remain on the back seat, as it seems to be more and more today? I was watching an interview that you gave recently, and you said in a very interesting way that we are in a world between orders, which at least, I mean, a bit like Karin, who says it could get worse, suggests that maybe there is an order after the present disorder. You said in the same interview that it's a world that is multipolar economically, but if I understand you correctly, not so much politically. And you add ominously that the international system is not responding. So really the question to you as a top diplomat is, how do we bring diplomacy back to the front seat? Speaking from India, and now today you're in Singapore, I mean, what role do you see for major powers like India, but also for smaller or medium-sized countries? What role do you see for them in bringing the world to a new order, hopefully, to avoid chaos? Over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Thank you for posing that question, and also for having me, for asking me here. The reason I say it's a world adrift, a world between orders, I think is threefold. One is, as you said, the world is economically multipolar, but militarily there's only one global superpower who can project military power wherever she wants, whenever she wants. And politically, the world is completely confused. We've seen the ineffectiveness of multilateral organizations. The last time the international community managed a coherent response to an international crisis was after the global financial crisis, the London G20 summit in 2009, when we prevented a Great Depression, saved the banks. And as Karin said, it could have been much worse. But you look at every crisis after that, pandemic, you look at the developing country debt crisis, which has been on us now for the last 4 years. The international community doesn't have a coherent response. Climate change. I mean, so for me, and you can see levels of conflict rising. You can see displaced persons, refugees at levels which we haven't known since just after World War II, when the Chinese Civil War was going on. So this is therefore for me a world between orders. And the reason is because the tools we rely on, the UN Security Council, multilateral organizations, no longer reflect the reality of the balance of power out there. Today, you have a strange situation where several great powers are revisionist powers. Secondly, the tools we rely on are primarily interstate tools. And these are organizations of member states that can only be as effective as the member states choose to make them. And as the member states, how effectively the member states work with each other. And we're in a situation where that's just not true. Great power relations are fraught. But being a world between orders, I think we need to change the way we think of the problem. And this is where I'm not as pessimistic as most of my colleagues, I find, for three reasons. Look at the reaction to the Russian invasion to Ukraine. The West imposed sanctions. And quite frankly, the financial sanctions have frightened everybody, that Russian reserves can be expropriated. I mean, that worries everybody. But quite apart from that, the West imposed sanctions, but most of the world chose not to. Most of Asia, most of Africa. And what the world is signaling here, I think, is quite clear, that we don't want to have to choose sides. We don't want to pick whether it is the West versus Russia or whether it's US, China. We don't want to end up in a binary, another Cold War. We don't want to, and because it's a world between orders, because politics and security issues are increasingly localized, it seems to me a space is opening up for middle powers, for other countries to actually play a role. So you look at Sri Lanka's debt crisis. the Bretton Woods and other institutions are doing nothing about it, frankly. I mean, it's been going on now for 6 months, but countries in the region have been helping and have actually enabled them to deal with it. And increasingly, you find that it's that sort of action by local actors. When refugees start pouring out of Myanmar, when there's trouble, it's local actions, the Chin, are taken care of by Mizo cousins on our side, rather than by the state structures or international organizations who are tasked to do this. So even though we are now in a world between orders, it seems to me this has opened up space. Secondly, I think this actually is a time when you can start thinking of how to reorganize the instruments that we have, start thinking of new instruments. For the time being, while we're between orders, I believe the answer is really issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. Not everybody is equally engaged in everything. And this idea that everybody in the UN has to get involved in every issue, it doesn't make sense anymore. And especially today when you're dealing with complicated issues. I know it, but that means a lot more diplomacy, a lot more hard work. I'm creating work for my tribe, I realize that. But more than that, it seems to me we have, on different issues, you need a different set of partners, whether it's maritime security, cyber security, whichever issues, or the debt crisis, for instance. Last point that I'd make is we are so used to thinking that stability is the goal. But at a time of change, when the balance of power is shifting, frankly, and to people who don't like the present situation, saying that stability, strategic stability is our goal, sounds like saying, you stay where you are, remain, drawers of water, hewers of wood. And that's not a very sensible approach. What we should be doing is managing change and putting in place the tools to manage change that's inevitable, because the world is changing around us. And all the things that we took for granted post-World War II, I think all the pillars of the old system are now gone, whether it's the economic or the use of multilateral organizations or even international law. And the norms, I think, have been flouted by the great powers so often in the last 3-4 decades. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not the first invasion that we've seen, first illegal invasion. So I think we now need to actually start thinking very differently about what we want at the end of this process. And for me, the only way to get there is diplomacy. But as I said, it's not going to be, I don't see it being global, because I see politics and security increasingly local.
Well,
so I'm not entirely pessimistic, but I do hope that we show, the wisdom to actually step up to this challenge.
Thank you very much. I mean, in what you say, I mean, I'm thinking of the non-alignment, which has been a historical position of India. India played a big role.
But I have an article coming out in Foreign Policy which says, not quite, but non-alignment redux, that you have a situation where, and I find that there are people around the world who are talking about finding third ways rather than being stuck in one binary or another.
Because what strikes me is that the spirit of Bandung, there was a kind of positive vision. And today there are a multiplicity of vision. You stress that. People don't want to be aligned with one camp or another, but I don't see yet a vision that could be the basis for a kind of shared common ground, which would create a kind of solid fabric for the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, not yet. But I think that's what we should be doing. And I'm sure that people who are in this room are the ones who can probably think it through.
You heard, huh? You have a lot of work to do. Now, let me turn, thank you, Shivshankar. Let me turn to Comfort Aero. And I'm very pleased to welcome Comfort at Columbia. As I said, she's the new president of Crisis Group. And before that, she was the former head of the It's Africa program. She is the first in Crisis Group to raise from the ranks. And I think it's a very good sign for the organization. For which I keep a special place in my heart for understandable reasons. Comfort, you have first-hand knowledge and understanding of the very wide range of conflict that plague our world. Crisis Group reports on Ukraine, but also on the Democratic Republic of Congo, on Colombia, on violence in Mexico. When I read the reports of Crisis Group, and I'm a faithful reader of them, and I invite all of you to do the same, it seems that top-down approaches to conflict resolution are less and less effective. And in a way, Ambassador Menon expressing the local, the regional, was making a similar point. So my question is, as you observe this transformation of conflict, do you have suggestions on how you can transform conflict resolution? Because at the same time, I don't forget what we heard from Hassan Salameh yesterday, that there is no such thing as a civil war which does not have foreign interference. And having been the SISG in Libya, he knew what he was talking about. So what's your answer to that? Can you give us some hope on that front?
Thank you very much. And of course, when your boss twice over, which you've been, Jean-Marie, calls you to come and do a panel, you've got no choice but to say yes. So it's nice to be in your company again, Jean-Marie, and also to be with you, Karin, physically. But it's good to see Ambassador Menon, who's a board member of Crisis Group, and then Funmi and Thomas and all the others. This is a very good question close to me, Jean-Marie. And just to follow up from what Ghassan said yesterday, the other internationalized civil war in our midst is Ethiopia as well, because it's very much characterized as internal, but we also know that it's been internationalized both within the region and the wider region. Jean-Marie, it's interesting because one of your opening remarks, and I took it down, was that you said states have assumed a central place. For a very long time, there was an attempt to shift the center of gravity away from the state, because the state was often and remains the source of contention. And we often looked for alternative structures or alternative pathways to get to peace. And we saw what you did, Karin, for example, in Burundi, looking for alternative pathways. And we also saw that in Liberia, where we emphasized civil society, or we emphasized communal relationships as well, especially where we saw that the sources of the conflicts were around ethnic communities. And so we focused our energies, as we did, on local, very localized responses to those conflicts. But for me, it was always clear that the state, that even though it was part of the problem, was part of the solution, and that you couldn't alter that reality as well, even as we tried to change the center of gravity as well. I think that's one of the lessons that I've learned from the last few years as well, that as much as we advocate for peace from below, you had to find a way in which to deal with multiple centers of authorities. And with, I think, the other challenge that we've seen in recent times with the rising or spreading of jihadi threats, whether it's in the Sahel or the Lake Chad Basin or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or even in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, we also saw proto-states in the form of these jihadi groups, who in themselves were states within a state, who in themselves would provide replica basic services where the state was often absent on peripheral places. We often found that these groups then themselves became legitimate forces, were seen often as legitimate actors in their own right and representing groups. And so we spent a lot of time, and we're suggesting also today that we need to include them in various peace processes and treat them as significant actors in the climate of actors. So I think what has changed in the last few years, surely, yes, is the rise of these new actors that we can't shift them out of the terrain. What is also clear is that, as we've seen in Mali, for example, Jean-Marie, after 10 years of hyper-militarization, as we characterized it when you were president of Crisis Group, after seeing a decade of securitization, it was very clear to us that we couldn't ignore these jihadi forces or these militant groups, that we had to treat them as actors in one form, whether they were interested in coming to the negotiating table, whether they were interested in peace, was another issue. But the fact is that we couldn't ignore them as well. Also, even in South Sudan, in Sudan, even in Yemen, it's clear that you couldn't decide to sidestep the Houthis, that you had to find a way in which to negotiate with them. But I think, going back to what you said, what Karin said, we can't wish away the state. And in fact, the outcome of Ukraine is contingent on two political leaders coming together to decide what kind of peace deal that they're willing to sign, what kind of ceasefire they're willing to decide. And also it's contingent on their allies, who are states as well, deciding whether they are willing to commit to that political deal. When the rest of us get involved will be when it's felt in our pockets, and when the cost of the war becomes a reality to us at home as well. So that's one layer of peace from above, Jean-Marie, the fact that we've got a multitude of actors, jihadi groups, militant groups, armed communal groups, and also another interesting set of actors, what we call the herder-farmer actors that we're seeing right across the Sahel, pastoralists, also another group of actors that we need to deal with. All I'm saying is that the multiplicity of actors in a conflict means that the center of gravity changes, which also means that the way in which we negotiate peace deals changes, which also means that the audience in which we talk to changes. The last set of actors that I haven't talked about, and is very pertinent in Africa particularly, is the youth population as well. Increasingly, the fighters, those who are caught up in the crossfire of the conflicts that we're dealing with, are very youthful population. They're at the center of the protests that we're seeing on the continent. They're at the center of the fighting that we're seeing. At the center of negotiating the new transitions that we're seeing, whether it's in Ethiopia, in Sudan, across West Africa, and across Central Africa. So we can't ignore them, but their weight in determining the future of this, I think, is negligible at the moment as well. The other set of actors, Jean-Marie, and you are very much the one who inspired this, and Funmi as well, was to rethink the nature of the institutions that are part of the process. So we invested a lot under you, as you recall, Jean-Marie, in regional peacekeeping or regional peacemaking, and using regional bodies, regional economic communities, a very novel idea at the time of the Liberian and Sierra Leonean Civil War in the 1990s, when the Security Council itself, as a result of lessons learned, or as a result of the crisis that the US faced in Somalia, were looking to other actors to step into the peacekeeping arena, then decided to invest in regional peacekeeping in the form of ECOWAS, and then followed on by bringing on the African Union. One of the lessons learned in this story, and it goes back to what Ambassador Menon was saying, is that in the end, although the region is part of the problem, it's also part of the solution. But oftentimes, these coalitions that we bring together are not just part of the problem, but they're also controversial actors in their own right. And I've often said, and you were there as President, Jean-Marie, when I said that even using African forces to step into a crisis doesn't get you out of the crisis. Oftentimes, and it's just as controversial. And so this notion of African solutions for African problems, which is the second part of your question, is not oftentimes the best answer. And often we have to rethink the coalition of the willing that we put together. In terms of what the conflict transformation landscape can look like. I very much hear what Ambassador Menon and Karin were saying. I don't think everything has been thrown out of the window at the moment. I still think there is something viable in parts of our system, despite the revisionist approaches that we're seeing from a number of countries. China, despite its agitation about the current international global order, still wants to be part of that global order, still wants to be part of that community of states. It wants to determine the nature of that institution. It wants to shape it, but it still wants to stay inside it and shape it from within and try to alter it from within. The question mark is whether President Putin wants to do that as well. And I think that is something for us to discuss going forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very substantive contribution. I'm going to turn to Professor Thomas Biersteker, who is joining us from Geneva. Professor Biersteker, you are one of the world best-known specialists of UN sanctions. The book that you co-edited always required reading for my students. And it is, but when I look at the situation, it's remarkable how in the last 2 decades, the Security Council, but also outside the UN framework, and certainly that's the case for Ukraine, the United States and the European Union have made an increasing use of targeted and so-called smart sanctions for a multiplicity of purposes. And it seems that in a world that is less ideological, economic leverage on individuals and nations is now seen as a kind of new tool for conflict management, which substitutes for or sometimes complements direct military engagement. And so my question to you is really, what is your assessment of that tool for conflict management? And in an increasingly fractured world, can UN sanctions still be adopted by the UN Security Council? Can they still be honestly implemented if they have been adopted? And if not, is there a risk that bilateral sanctions will increasingly replace UN sanctions and become more an instrument of war than an instrument of peace, if I may say?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm very pleased to be part of this very, very excellent panel. Let me try to, there are a lot of things in the question or questions, but let me just go back to something Karin said at the outset about the situation with sanctions on the Security Council. And I'm afraid I would have to characterize the situation today as one of gridlock, certainly when it comes to sanctions. And it's important to note that this gridlock precedes the current crisis over Ukraine. For example, we haven't seen any new sanctions regimes at the UN created since 2017. The regime was created for Mali. And even that was a struggle because it was only approved because the Malian government at the time supported the idea. It's interesting to put this in context because before, as you mentioned, Jean-Marie, before 2017, there was an average of 1 new sanctions regime created every year after 1990. That is, we saw 26 new sanctions regimes created between 1991 and 2017, but we've seen no new sanctions regimes over the past 5 years. There's a similar pattern that exists with regard to listings and delistings, because until 2019, new listings, this is particular individual designations or designations of firms or corporate entities, exceeded delistings of individuals or corporate entities. But since 2019, and therefore over the course of the past 3 years, we've seen that delistings have exceeded new listings in each year. Now, much of this has to do with the winding down of the Iraq regime, the delisting of office, but it also is a broader trend. It's very difficult to get agreement for new listings. Just look at the gap between what exists in the monitoring group reports on Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and what actually results in new listings. Beyond this, below the level of the Security Council, there are battles within the Secretariat and below the Council meeting levels over appointments of new panel members. Russia placed a hold on financing panel members for a number of African armed conflict regimes in 2021, complaining that they were too dominated by Western experts. There was also a dispute over the appointment of the US member of the DPRK panel, according to some, an effort to strengthen the hands of Russia that have repeatedly been criticized for the evasion of the coal exports and the oil import embargoes. But delays of the reports are now common, particularly when sanctions violations by Russia or China are identified in the reports. And there also appear to be deadlocks among the panel of experts themselves, particularly in the DPRK again, over the presentation of reports to the Sanctions Committee. Now, more broadly, if I just say focus on the DPRK for a moment, there's a stalemate over the DPRK sanctions regime in general. In 2016 and 2017, we saw a new UN Security Council resolution applying ever broader sanctions every single time the DPRK either conducted a nuclear test or launched a long-range missile, to the point that the regime began to approximate a comprehensive sanctions regime. And that really is a departure from the trend we saw for the last 20 years at the UN. But today, there have been repeated long-range missile launches, and while the US, UK, and France have called for new sanctions, Russia and China have reintroduced their 2019 sanctions relief proposals in exchange for no concessions from the DPRK, either on humanitarian grounds or to support negotiations more generally. So the situation could be characterized as one in which the interventionists, the P3, face off against the sovereigntists. But it's interesting to look at developments in Ukraine again, as everyone is mentioning, that sort of overshadowed all of these discussions. And ironically, they reversed at least the argument, the positions and arguments. Russia is cynically invoking R2P to justify the invasion, and China remains strangely silent about this challenge to its long-held position against intervention, the use of force, and its support for the territorial integrity of UN member states. It's interesting that all sanctions regimes established since 1994, at least, have been technically targeted, that is, non-comprehensive regimes. But it's important to point out that if we look at the 14 ongoing sanctions regimes under the UN sanctions architecture at the moment, there's a considerable variation in the potential scope of impact on the general population. So there's a degree of discrimination that varies quite a lot, from the DPRK at one end of the continuum to Mali and to South Sudan and Sudan on the other end of the continuum. But this is an issue that has been very important for a very significant of concern to the humanitarian community more generally today. So as I said a moment ago, 14 UN sanctions regimes remain in place as part of the UN's formal architecture. But if you look over the last 2 or 3 years, we see very few developments within those existing regimes over that period. Mostly, again, as Karin and others mentioned, rollovers of existing restrictive measures. Now, if we step back a second, and perhaps this has been the glory days of multilateralism and UN activity and the application of sanctions, not as the policy themselves, but as a tool to support mediation, to support other aspects of political intervention and political missions, and as well as peacekeeping missions. And I think it's very important not to just focus on sanctions, although I do, of course, in much of my work, but to look at how sanctions are just one of the tools, and how we should look at how sanctions interact with other forms of intervention, be it diplomacy, be it diplomatic negotiations, or either mediation or negotiation, or threats of force with actual use of force, or the deployment of peacekeepers. But what we're seeing globally with regard to sanctions trends, I think, is parallel to what some of the other speakers have already identified this afternoon for me, or this morning for you in New York. And that is that this gridlock at the UN has led to an increase in what I would describe informal institutional coordination, or what I term in a forthcoming book, informal multilateralism, or informal forms of governance, where we see unilateral or autonomous sanctions regimes, typically led by the US, but joined by the EU and the UK, and often by Canada, Australia, and as we've seen in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Singapore. So it's not just a Western sanctions regime entirely, at least in the current case of sanctions on Russia. So this is a very, in fact, it's most obvious in some sequencing variations, it's most obvious in the reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's a return to coalitions of the willing, but this time in the sanctions realm. Now, these measures, as we are seeing, can have powerful effects and consequences, But without greater global participation, they leave gaps for non-sanctioning member states that will invariably limit their impact and effectiveness. And we're seeing this both with regard to South Asia and to a lesser extent, some parts of East Asia today. Lots of other developments in sanctions we're seeing move toward thematic regimes rather than country-based sanctions regimes. I believe the UK is considering serious and organized crime sanctions regimes. And we've also seen the development of cyber sanctions, which are not on cyber targets, but in response to cyber attacks. So we're seeing a combination of informal governance in this particular domain, and one in which it's important to think through the potential interactions of these with other sanctions regimes, because it's actually not, it's important to point out that sanctions are not only coming from Europe and North America, but sanctions, and I think quite understudied sanctions regimes are present in Africa as well. The African Union regularly applies certain forms of sanctions, and ECOWAS has been quite active in its use of sanctions. When we think about sanctions today, increasingly, we need to look at not only their interactions with other policy tools, but also their interactions with systems of restrictive measures being applied by different institutional actors. So it partly gets to your question. I can go on about effectiveness and discrimination and so on, but I'll save that. Or actually, just one point. Let me just conclude with one point. I often make it as a beginning just to talk about sanctions to a more general audience, and that is to say, yes, sanctions today are overused, but at the same time, I think they're underutilized. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is they're underutilized as threats for deterrence purposes. They're underutilized not just in terms of their design and application and implementation, but they're also underutilized as a potential source for mediation and negotiation. So my current research project is focused on how sanctions relief can be used as a tool to facilitate negotiations of ongoing conflicts. And I think we oftentimes, it's much easier to apply the measures and think about additional measures that could be applied than it is, in fact, to think about how their selective relief can be used materially to support mediation or negotiation in ongoing conflicts.
Very interesting points. And your last one gives us a lot of food for thought. I would want to turn to Funmi Olonisakin. You are the vice president of one of the UK's most distinguished research and education institution, King's College London. You've been very active in the African Leadership Center. You've been members of boards of various NGOs. So you're both a scholar and a practitioner. And in this world that we're discussing, where norms are steadily being eroded, where the state remains a key actor, as we were reminded by actually all speakers, but where multilateral institutions are challenged, are fragmenting, there's really no agreed framework of reference today in the world. And of course, we can just lower our ambitions, but it does raise a question of where is our moral compass? What role do you see for non-governmental institutions and also for individuals, for independent scholars like you in giving us some kind of compass and beacon in a world that lacks a sense of direction? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. It's so nice to be here and to see, familiar faces. And I really appreciate this invitation. Thank you so much. But let me respond to this in three ways. One is to at least try to set a context for the kinds of questions and issues that relate to the question you're asking me. And the first is to really ask honestly, where are the respected, independent, alternative voices of before? As you know, when you led peacekeeping at the UN, Jean-Marie, when I was there myself for a few years, we had those active segments of the international NGO community we had several area formula meetings to get those voices, and there was a lot of action in the UN Security Council itself. But that just seems like ages ago now, because if you really look at non-governmental entities today, they're not what they used to be. They're either too localized, too politicized, with few exceptions, of course. Oh, there are always exceptions, or too powerless. And the alternative that Comfort was talking about too in terms of the regional organizations, if you look at Africa, the African Union that was just mentioned by Thomas, or ECOWAS, a shadow of themselves. If you look at the number of times they have not applied those sanctions or defended the very normative frameworks that they themselves established. And so we are we're now looking at a world in which the alternative voices are not necessarily organized civil society. They're the sort of actors that Comfort talked about, and amongst those actors are the range of youth movements. And my next question, therefore, is who does the UN Security Council speak for, if not for the kind of state order that is falling apart as we know it? And I want to argue very strongly that there is no doubt a crisis of state in and of itself. It's not just about the multilateral setting that we're talking about. But so therefore, when you look at the UN Security Council, and I think Karin was already talking about the range of issues that are removed from its agenda just because you cannot find a way out or consensus amongst the P5 around these issues. What does it, what do we do about the zones of silence? Mm-hmm. These zones of silence are the kinds of issues, the people, the places in the majority world where, if you like, the UN Security Council can no longer spread its tentacles around. And I think Comfort listed some of those places nicely. And that's why I really underscore this crisis of state in a sense. So we're looking at non-interstate situations that the UN Security Council has no handle on, but transnational places, the transnationalism and the orientation towards that amongst a plethora of actions. And yet these places carry both solutions as well as problems. So because we're not responding to those problems, since they're not on the agenda of the UN Security Council, we cannot find solutions in those arenas as well. And I have always believed that, at least we have sufficient evidence to know that many of these zones of silence carry very important transformational ideas and agendas as well. So my last set of questions is this really. If we say we have this crisis of state and therefore a zone of silence in the majority world where all sorts of things happen, not all terrible things, but many terrible things, and we're saying the United Nations Security Council does not speak for this place, even the place that it speaks for, which is the conversation around Ukraine, when the very norms and rules that were established at the end of the Second World War that we've all spoken to, when they are violated so egregiously, who stands up for it? And this is where, if we talk about independent voices, the questions that I don't even know whether they're coming out of independent or non-independent voices are questions about the way we pursue peace. We're going to pursue peace at this moment in time in the world. And I think the pathways are very narrow to that pursuit of peace. It's either we really, and actually, I think this is too sensitive for any big UN member states to be talking about, but it has to be spoken about. That if those post-World War II rules have been so seriously violated, who's asking what is going to take us across the bridge? Is there a bridge, which I'll come to in diplomacy as my concluding statement. But before we get to that bridge that leads us to the kinds of stable peace that we want, is anyone asking the question about how this might get worse? Mm-hmm. Because I think we were clear. I think the rules are clear about a war of aggression and about crimes against humanity. Forget the crimes against humanity one. That has been violated so many times over. But this international law framework that guarded this, guarded us because the great powers defended it in particular ways, or at least they did not cross that line. When it has been crossed, who says no? It's too, this has gone too far. And of course, the no-fly zone idea that Zelensky was proposing, I understand it, that if you want to ensure that we do not have an accidental war, accidental nuclear war for that matter, that was an initial solution. But who are the powers that be that will call the shots and say, if it has to take the use of force, that's what it will be to restore us to where we were. And I'm not even suggesting that it has to be the only solution, but we're not having that conversation. And for as long as it's empty threats that the rest of the world see, that's what Putin sees. I think it's important to really recognize that at this moment, no conversation is being had, at least not loudly, about the possibility of stopping a Putin that might spread to other parts of Europe. I leave that at that. But if my zone is in peace building, but as a war studies scholar, I must say that these are questions we're not even raising or really talking about in any systematic way in order to prevent a slide to that kind of war, which is not beyond the realm of possibility. Lastly, on the question of diplomacy, I think from what I have observed, the diplomacy as we understood it classically, after all, this is about the peacemaker's toolbox here. Diplomacy is not about friends talking to each other. It's about people who are not on the same page, having a very difficult conversation and talking about and making every effort towards it. And so if it's not that kind of conversation, we can say, okay, Macron has tried, various actors have tried. Many people are silently on the side of Putin on this occasion. How many of them have we put around the table to have some really clear conversations with and persist on it so that only that side is on the table, is on the other side at the end of the day? And I don't see this very obviously. Clearly, it's not my day job anymore, but I still try to follow this as a researcher. And I fear that we are staying so much within the old parameters that we're not really exploring new ways of doing this, because I think other speakers have spoken eloquently to this. These are very new times. And if we're in that kind of in-between world that the ambassador spoke about, we need to act like we're in that world. And so as a scholar, I can give this sort of comments and think, to a conclusion. I can't think to a decision. It's for practitioners to do. Thank you so much.
I don't know if the practitioners are going to thank you for that.
And Funmi has good answers as well.
They would like the answer, but the answer is hard. And you raised very, very difficult questions on rules, who enforces them. Ambassador Menon gave us some hints of direction. There's a coalition of the willing. There's a growing group of countries that want a predictable world, that need a measure of rules. Now, does that lead to the use of force, or does that lead to creating a critical mass of countries that abide by rules? Because rules in the international system, they're always, there is no such thing as an international community, if I may say. So there is not the police force of the world. The peacekeepers are not the police force of the world. So we always are in this intermediate situation where rules are in the eye of the beholder. And so if there are many beholders, then the rules begin to have some strength. And that is this, they are dikes of sand. But the dikes of sand can resist if there is a lot of sand. And that's the ambiguous situation in which we try to be. I think we saw yesterday that we have a very engaged audience of diplomats. So without further ado, I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments. And so you introduce yourself for the panelists. I mean, begin to know you, but the panelists don't. So please give your name and affiliation before speaking. So. No, I just, well, okay, yes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Fernando. I work with the UN Office of Counterterrorism. And I have a question, after thanking, of course, the panelists for the very interesting, thought-provoking interventions. I have a question concerning the relationships between sanctions and mediation, or the other way around. There's a very interesting study, and Professor Biersteker participated in that, about this relationship. And one of the findings was that the prospect of delisting for some groups offers some hope or some interest for them to participate in negotiations. So I'm just curious about your views and the panel's views about what happened in Afghanistan, in Taliban more recently. There may have been an incentive for them to participate and come to the table, but I was just wondering about what happens once they get to the parties to the table, and to get something meaningful out of that participation.
Thank you. And so I'm Kelly White. I'm with the UK mission to the UN here. There was some wonderful comments, especially I really liked the reflections around the shifting center of gravity and the role that proto-states play in kind of undermining the continuation of conflict. I was actually quite struck by Karin's comments around the blacklist. And I was wondering, I was welcoming reflections from panelists around what items they would like to see brought onto the Council's agenda that are currently on that blacklist. What would your priorities be? And then second was just around strengthening the capacity around early warning, both within the Council and within broader UN organs as well, in terms of how do you think the Council and other parts of the UN should strengthen their early warning capacity to actually prevent conflict as well?
Thank you so much. Caroline Quinn, also from the UK mission. Comfort, very good to see you again. Two quick questions, if I may. One, building on Kelly's question about early warning. Can any of the panelists suggest any ways that Council members or the wider membership might encourage the Secretary General to make more use of Article 99 of the Charter, which gives him or her the power to bring any matter that he or she thinks is a threat to international peace and security to the attention of the Council? That's extremely underused. And then my second question is just coming back to this matter of kind of regional African solutions to African problems. Ambassador Martin Kimani, the Kenyan PR, has been extremely vocal in his view that the current multilateral system does not offer the kind of tools that address the security challenges that African countries in particular are facing. And he's been very scathing both about sanctions and the limitations of sanctions regimes as they apply to terrorist groups, and about peacekeeping. Is he right? And if he is, how should we look to adapt those tools and mechanisms? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get this first batch of question, and then we'll come back to the room. So the first question was for Professor Biersteker on sanctions mediation. Professor, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the question. It is, I should point out that the report that we produced, I did this with David Lantz, who's now with the ICG actually, and with Rebecca Brubaker, who's now formerly at UNU and now at Interpeace. And we looked not only at the possibilities for complementarity, but we also looked at the other side of the relationship between sanctions and mediation. And that is the points at which sanctions can actually complicate or contradict mediation and negotiation efforts. So to be fair, there are two sides to this. The key example that we had about strategic use of delisting was an example actually from Afghanistan. It was Hekmatyar, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and the way in which the promise of delisting was contingent on his then recognition of the then Afghan government. And so that was, I would say, one of the examples of the promise leading to what we talk about the use of sanctions as a way to try to drive a wedge within an existing regime or ruling group. Now, it wasn't, this is very small scale. It's an example of one individual who was significant at one point in the conflict. Of course, it's a very, very long, decades-long conflict. It's hard to generalize that up to, or to broaden it to the entire Taliban, most of whom, by the way, were designated in 2002 in a very different time. And I may just comment that one of the challenges with sanctions regimes in general is the challenge of adapting them to very, very dramatically changing situations. It's one of the things in our own analysis of sanctions in general, but UN sanctions in particular. We use the concept of episode to differentiate between what are the measures being applied at any given point in time, who are the targets of those measures, and what are the purposes of those measures. And if we look at the fact that the sanctions regime in Somalia has been in place since 1991, it's obviously morphed from one aspect of the conflict to another and to another and another yet again. And in the case of the Taliban as well. And the challenge oftentimes is adapting the existing regimes in order to make them, in a sense, fit for purpose. And that requires agreement on the council. If I can quickly answer the third question, just a brief moment about the Kenyan ambassador's critiques of sanctions. Often, if I'm giving a general talk about sanctions, I usually begin by saying everybody loves to hate sanctions. And it's particularly true living here in Geneva. I can assure you that most of the communities I interact with are critical, saying they don't work, they target the wrong people, they have undesirable humanitarian effects. Why do we keep overusing these measures? And I just want to say that at least from the studies that we have done in particular on United Nations sanctions, it's a bit of a false trope. Sanctions don't work. On average, it's a low probability outcome. We think about 20% of the episodes, we can see the effectiveness of UN sanctions in some form. But it's important to differentiate about the different purposes of sanctions, because sanctions that are intended to, most sanctions are intended to change behavior, but that's not the only motivation. We argue that they're only effective 10% of the time if you're trying to change behavior. But drawing on the literature and in war studies, I'm thinking about Robert Pape's work on bombing to win. Historically, changing behavior is a very low probability outcome. If you're trying to constrain an actor by making prescribed activities more difficult, well, then our percentages go up to about 25% of the time. And if you're trying to send a normative signal, and I think it's very important when we brought in the reference to important, significant international norms, all UN sanctions, I think, are intended to signal support for certain types of norms. And then we get to a more effective around 30% of the time. So before we throw them out altogether, yes, they're problematic. It's not that I'm arguing that sanctions are good or useful for everything, but in fact, they can be useful. And we need simply to look carefully at the individual cases and differentiate by the purposes before we simply dismiss the tool altogether. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think the next questions were to Karin Landgren.
Thanks. I want to come at this from a slightly broader view, but also I thought I was going to be the first one to mention the Secretary General, and you pipped me to it. It's really striking when we are all talking about the absence of enough leadership, the absence of enough diplomacy, that we are actually not mentioning the Secretary General in that conversation. And I very much think that, especially in the absence of collective coherence behind a political strategy, to come back to that, the Secretariat and the Secretary General need to do much more to generate and sell their strategies for peace, including prevention in specific situations. They do not do that. And we were all, I think, so struck by hearing the Secretary General speak out in defense of the Charter and then calling on Russia not to invade Ukraine, because we realized he often doesn't do that. That was such a rare statement. Now, good people can disagree about how vocal the SG should be, but even if he is not vocal, he needs to be present with the big powers. And I think this is very important, in the possession of clear strategies that have the Secretariat behind them. This is where I want to come back to some of Thomas's points about sanctions. A strategy is necessarily an integrated thing where you bring the whole toolkit, the spectrum that the Hippo report talked about. And that is often lacking as well. This sort of integrated approach where all the complicated things get factored in, including the regional organizations, the various groups. I had a depressing moment recently in a closed-door conversation about Mali and MINUSMA, where a permanent member, being highly critical of MINUSMA, said, listen, you need to stop all this stuff in the villages with mediation and stuff like that. You are not a special political mission. You are a peacekeeping operation. Get out there and fight. And I thought, oh my God, there's a big conversation to be had there precisely around what an integrated strategy looks like. And I'm the first to say that a peacekeeping operation is not there to fight its way to peace. But I think that when we talk about what the Security Council blacklist is, prevention is a big part of that, because countries are so reluctant to be discussed in the Council and are even so reluctant to be discussed internally within the Secretariat that there is even a significant self-censorship on the part of the Secretariat and the leadership to bringing these issues to the Council's attention. I know that some current members are keen to restore what used to be called horizon scanning and the like, looking at clouds on the horizon. I think one of the things the UN needs to also get much better at integrating is questions of political economy. So scrutinizing economic interests in conflict and fragile settings is enormously sensitive. It does get wrongly labeled as development. It's not, it's a conflict driver. The role of organized crime as well is insufficiently looked at. And these are parts of the puzzle that have often been missing. So members of the Council actively try not to discuss things that can be labeled human rights or development. When I came into this job 4 years ago, I questioned why they didn't discuss more of pandemics, cyber, disarmament, and inequality. For better or for worse, I got some of my wish there. They're still not strong on disarmament. But even inequality has come into the discussion via COVID-19 vaccine access. That is, I mean, guardedly, that is a positive move in an overall bleak scenario. But it is incumbent on us to keep discussing these things and to keep coming up with potential strategies. I was reminded when you were speaking, Jean-Marie, of when I was on the Women's March in January 2017, one of the great signs was, we are the leaders we have been looking for. Let's not wait for the Secretary General. Let's not wait for various coalitions to come up with these comprehensive strategies. I think we all have a role in putting things forward.
Thank you. Let's go for the next round of questions.
I wanted to respond to this last question on
yes,
on the Perm Rep Kimani here, and I'm not sure who you asked the question, and also just quickly on early warning. I mean, it wouldn't surprise you as an organization whose work is conflict prevention to say that the last few months have seen a sort of a failure of much of the guiding principles that we focus on. And I think what Ukraine reaffirms is that, you know, member states, whether it's the Security Council or the European Union, need to do better at anticipating risks. But the real gap, the real challenge is not early warning, but there's a gap between warning and action as well. And right now, what we're doing is reacting as opposed to acting to something that we've anticipated. And Ukraine didn't start on the 24th of February. It started in 2014, and even prior to that. But, you know, just on the Kimani's own response and challenging and saying that the current multilateral framework doesn't respond to African problems. Well, here's a list of apparent African solutions. So in the face of anti-French protest and anti-Western reaction, the response is to bring in Wagner, as though that's somehow an alternative security structure to deal with the crisis in Mali. I wager that Wagner are going to face the same problems that the French faced in Mali. In response to trying to find a peaceful solution to the crisis in Central African Republic, the response of President Deby was to support a rebellion in CAR rather than to look for a peacekeeping way, a peace mediation out of that. In response to East Africa, Eastern DRC, Jean-Marie, which you very well know well, we have the return of a proxy war. And that proxy war is being fought again in East Africa instead of being settled through diplomacy between Kagame and Museveni through the African Union. And in response to unconstitutional takeover of power, we've seen 3 or 4 coups in the region. The AU has come up with mixed messages. If this is the response by the continent to its own multilateralism, then I think we're in danger. So that would be my response. I mean, I think Funmi even said it well, calling into questions this alternative response, if it's also not based on principles and if it's not also based on what I thought was a very robust constitutive act by the African Union. The African Union has a very clear rules and resolutions and decisions to deal with these things. If the Union and its member states were to focus on the resolution, it would be more forward-leaning than even the Security Council in responding to these crises.
Thank you. Important points. So let's have a new series of questions. Yes, introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Tisvi Ekmejoglu from the EU delegation in New York. Thanks to all for the excellent ideas, challenging, our intellectual capacities this morning. I have a quick question that I don't know if it is easy. It's about Russia and of course Ukraine. And my question is, we saw that Russia has been expelled from the Human Rights Council, has been expelled by the Council of Europe, and there is a tendency to isolate Russia from different also ECOSOC and other subsidiary bodies and election. So we see this pursue, even we heard that there is also even an initiative on Russia Federation status to the UN and the Security Council possibly. So my question is, by isolating or rejecting Russia from all these multilateral bodies, how it can help in the mediation? Is it something that can be used? Or I just wanted your assessment. Thank you.
Good morning, Martin Veles from UNDPPA. First, a comment and then 2 questions. First, my comment is, it feels like the toolbox of the peacemakers is a heavy one. There are more and more instruments in there. Sometimes we're lacking the batteries. Some of them are rusty. But I feel this is a growing toolbox. And I wonder whether this is getting too much at one point, whether we actually rather need just a screwdriver, right? Or the Swiss Army knife, which has a few elements and not an additional new tech toy in the box. So that's a comment and a question together. A concrete question about the General Assembly. We have talked and heard a lot about the end of multilateralism, but this is all with a focus on the Security Council. And at the same time, we have seen a lot of unity, much more than in the last decades in the General Assembly. And there have been a number of resolutions taken, and the GEA is also still in charge for adopting the UN budget. So that's kind of, if you think about power, that's kind of a powerful authority. So I wonder what you think the future of the GEA in the context of peace and security could be, and how the initiatives that we have seen could be reshaped to actually make the UN, not just the Council, but the UN at large, more effective. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stevana, and I'm from the UN Verification Mission in Colombia. I think we all agreed on the challenges with the Security Council. I think on the positive side, for example, for Colombia, if it wouldn't mean that we report every 3 months to the Security Council, the peace agreement would have failed a long time ago. We also see with Resolution 1325 that the Security Council now has become sort of a challenging friend to debate it. And with Ukraine, you have said that it hasn't helped very much. And in line with the question of Martin, I was also wondering, because we see more and more, especially middle-income countries, governments that they want to step into peace and security, but they are not part of the big players, and what role they could play away from the regional organizations, because I think we need more inter-regional debates around peace and security. I think many countries, even especially middle-income countries, are too afraid to recognize, for example, that they have a domestic conflict that is localized because they don't want to be perceived as a conflict-affected country. So they treat it as public security with measures that are not helping, particularly around organized crime. But there is no really space to talk and have a common understanding around peace and security because that belongs to Security Council, conflict-affected countries. So, for example, in Latin America, drug trafficking, no, that's not conflict, that's just organized crime, but they don't have the tools to solve it when they can learn a lot more from the other actors. And also in line, for example, where do you see SDG 16? I feel is underutilized because that could, the one on peace and, it's not peace and security, but I think they use it a lot more on public security. And I think it could be a tool to bring other states in another tool that is not necessarily through the Security Council.
Thank you very much to the panelists for this very thought-inducing discussion today. I'm Sammy from the German mission to the UN. And I was wondering, trying to be a bit provocative, because that's, I guess, part of our mission. How do we, at one point, accept that certain mediation processes or attempts of developing political solutions in ongoing conflicts are either counterproductive or maybe at best a waste of time? To give you some examples, I mean, as a German, I'm allowed to say that there's a lot of criticism on the Minsk agreement, where some say, look, it was comforting, it was probably the right thing to do at the time in the situations, but we should have been aware much earlier that particularly one party was basically misusing it to, show some level, like to pretend that they're open to a solution while building up to plan and do what they're doing right now. We have the Geneva process on Syria, where we've known that this has been an immense waste of time. Everybody knew, all actors involved knew that, and I'm not trying to disrespect the efforts of the SRSGs and the genuine efforts of the parties involved in the UN, but we kind of knew it's at best a waste of time and maybe even counterproductive in terms of keeping other solutions, new mechanisms from being developed. So I'm wondering whether there are any ideas on developing mechanisms while encouraging and supporting mediation, as of course is still a very important tool, to reassess regularly and be frank with ourselves. I know it's much more complicated than this because there's so many actors involved and so many interests, but be frank with ourselves and stop a process or reinvent a process or just, destroy and rebuild when it's still time to do so, rather than risk, risk basically stalling the process by just insisting on this absolutely inefficient and sometimes counterproductive process. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, I'm going to turn to the panelists to answer all those good questions. And I will ask each panelist to have its final remarks. I see Funmi.
Yes, yes, please. No, thank you so much. I thought some of the comments and questions were, really spot on. And this question about this General Assembly will be my starting point. I have, as you know, this myself as a scholar of war studies and as someone whose, academic work has focused on peacekeeping for a long time. I fear very much for the United Nations Security Council in terms of loss of relevance. And I think we're risking its loss of relevance now. At critical moments in the past, we can take the crisis in the Congo as an example. I believe we can take Korea as well as an example, where the uniting for peace resolutions were the things that really put the General Assembly at the top of its game. And I think that we're seeing a role for the General Assembly now. I think the sooner the General Assembly takes steps to use the powers that it always thinks that it does not have, but which it actually has by its numbers, to really determine the course of the United Nations over the next period. Unless it does that, I fear that the UN Security Council risks irrelevance. It will be seen as irrelevant in very many ways very quickly. But this last comment from our colleague from the German mission to the US, I think is also highly relevant. We need to always say, what is the role? Do we always need the council? Do we also always need processes? And I think being able to limit what the Council can do, what particular parts of the UN can do to a particular period and review them quickly will be one of the best ways forward. The horizon scanning comment of Karin is excellent. We used to do that. I don't think that we have done this in a while. I just think that there's a sense of urgency at this moment. And if those who can act can really take steps to do what they haven't done before, the General Assembly being one of them, it will be a good way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will turn to Ambassador Menon because it's very late in Singapore already, and when there are several questions that he could answer, I think in particular on the question of isolating Russia, it's interesting to have a non-European perspective on this question and any other question that you would want to address.
Well, it seems to me that frankly, you make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. So isolating, not talking, for me is really certainly not the diplomat's way of arriving at peace. And I am not so sure that sanctions, isolating actually lead to productive outcomes. Hikmatyar was mentioned as a successful example where the threat of delisting worked. Frankly, Hikmatyar went into the Karzai government because the Pakistanis, who were his biggest, he was their favorite among the 7, Mujahideen groups in the Peshawar Shura. And he depended on Pakistani support. And Musharraf felt that Karzai was drifting away from him and therefore pushed the Hizb into the Afghan government and system. And I think that's what drove him, not the sanctions. I mean, the threat of sanctions didn't deter Putin from invading the Ukraine. And I think we need to understand, exactly what Karin was saying, that it takes a strategy and it takes an integrated approach to actually make any of these tools work. My own sense is that isolation and so on is not going to lead to peace or to it could help you to achieve other goals, such as weakening a country and so on. But that's not what I think we are about here. We're about trying to build peace. And so for me, there is a fundamental issue here where we shouldn't let our instruments or the processes distract us or actually lead us away from the outcomes that we are actually aiming at. And I think we need now today, having seen what's happened and the deadlock that we've been talking about in the organs that are supposed to be making peace, I think now is the time to actually rethink the way in which we go about our business. I am very pessimistic actually in the long run about the effects of what is happening, not just in Ukraine, but around Ukraine. The weaponization of everything, literally, even, the transfer of money. I think, frankly, in the long run, this is going to make our job of peacemaking much, much more difficult than it's been even in the recent past.
Thank you. Comfort?
No, I think Ambassador Menon has really said it. And the last point, I think, should be a wake-up call for us in terms of what we're giving up as a result of Ukraine and what we may not be able to protect. The race, the arms control, questions even around nuclear capabilities, a number of countries looking themselves and saying, well, Ukraine gave up the nuclear capability in the hope that Russia wouldn't encroach in it. And if this is the end result, then we all should start arming ourselves as well. And to watch also, as you were saying, Karin, not only are we struggling now with protecting important aid, but you've seen a number of countries now rethinking their own budgetary sort of division vis-a-vis putting more money on the arms industry versus development aid. Jean-Marie, you said it very well yourself, in terms of rethinking what the future looks like. I do want to underline that I don't think we should throw everything out of out of the toolbox. There are certain things that I think are worth preserving. And I want to go back to what you started a few decades ago around partnerships as well. But to underline also that in the whole building of a coalition of willing, it is not a beauty contest. It's very clear that not everybody has the capacity to act on their own. It's very clear from Ukraine, even before Ukraine, in Afghanistan, in the DRC, we saw it in Sudan, we saw it in the Sahel. We saw that there's no one actor that has the capacity to pursue or define a peace process and to implement it fully, that you need a set of actors, you need people from the region, you need national actors, and you need regional actors also. The other final point I would say, I think one of the lessons also from Ukraine is just our inability to anticipate, but also to build scenarios and then to build policy scenarios and responses when we know these things are coming down the tunnel. I think is a test now for the Security Council, not just to project or for a number of us, not just to project what is to come, but to also project what the possible answers are to those crises that we see down the road. I say it, by the way, Jean-Marie, because of the standoff we're seeing right now between the international community and the Taliban. At what point do you recognize that the Taliban is the only game in town? And how then do you negotiate with an actor that you may see, you may want to turn up your nose, but the reality is you have to engage with them?
Absolutely. Professor Biersteker.
Okay, set of very interesting questions. Let me comment briefly on each. I think the point about isolating Russia, I think if you look at the cases, the Human Rights Council and the Council of Europe, those are normative statements. They're actions about fundamental norms, and the idea of it's not I think an attempt to isolate Russia across the board would be a major mistake. So the kind of isolation should be selective, should be limited. In these cases, I think it's part of the norm articulation of the organizations themselves that is behind the isolation. Ultimately, there will be some kind of engagement, and this goes perhaps to the fourth question. My colleague from the German mission it's not a matter of, yes, there are times, I know this is an ongoing debate at the moment about, is this the right time for mediation and negotiation in the Ukraine crisis? But here I think it's a matter of timing. It's not a matter of will there eventually be negotiation. Ultimately, I think there will be. So it's only a matter of whether or not this is a propitious time for that kind of engagement. Second point, this person from DPBA, I like the reference to the Swiss Army knife. So that's I'm afraid we don't have a Swiss Army knife for all forms of peace building, peacekeeping, peace maintenance. But I do think the second point about the General Assembly, I want to echo Funmi's comments about the General Assembly, and to say that we do need creative thinking. We've seen it already in response to the use of the veto, and now the fact, right, small concession, but at least those Security Council members imposing a veto or utilizing the veto now have to explain themselves. And at least that's a public accountability that they didn't have before. But also, I think we need to think creatively about other mechanisms. Think about the international, impartial, independent mechanism for Syria as a way of coming up with something creative at the General Assembly level that in the case that obviously the Security Council couldn't manage. Third, the colleague from Colombia, very interesting point about, maybe I misheard you, but thinking beyond regional organizations. I like the idea of interregional discussions because sometimes the regional organizations are themselves the problem. I mean, just think of the Saudi over-implementation of the sanctions on Yemen as an example, or how the Yemen the crisis has been exacerbated by the regional organization. But I'll come back just with one final point, and it's really to echo the point that Karin and others made about the importance of strategic thinking about the application of multiple instruments, not just the screwdriver or the Swiss Army knife, but in fact, too often times we're operating in silos within the UN, just as we do in the academy. We have sanctions specialists, we have peace operations specialists. We need to expand the discussions and see how these various mechanisms interact. And in fact, whenever anybody thinks about applying sanctions, we need to think through strategically, how is this going to have effects and how is it related to other instruments that are simultaneously being applied? Thanks.
Thank you. Karin, you will have the last word.
Thank you so much. It's been such a treat to listen to everyone on this panel, and the questions as well have been absolutely excellent. So a few quick points. There is a huge new arms race ahead, and we are barely talking about it. So when we talk about our failure to imagine scenarios and plan policy accordingly, let's talk a little more about the arms race we're facing and what the impact is going to be, the losses we're going to have, the threats this will bring us. On the GA has been galvanized recently, and that's been very interesting. But I think this has also helped drive the desire for non-alignment. Many members of the GA got tired very quickly about being lobbied intensively by every side every week on those two votes. And I think we're seeing that often this may be less about charter values and more about practical alignment. And I'm not dissing who you need to be aligned with for practical purposes, but there is a limit to what the GA will be able to do to stand up for the charter, in my view. I think going to the comment about Colombia and also middle-income countries, the Security Council experience with Colombia has been really interesting, I believe, because Colombia approached the Council with pretty open arms, and that's rare for a country with a problem. Of course, they had a peace agreement, but it enabled the Council really to relish the positive role they were able to play in Colombia. And until last October's coup, a bit the same was happening with Sudan and UNITANS. Sudan also was cooperating with the Security Council. That is really a model where it can happen. Everyone feels like that's win-win, and the Council can be more effective when countries say what they need. Which takes us to the complicated nature of conflict. The time is really now to rethink what the UN and others, but what the UN is doing in Mali, what the UN is doing in Haiti. The tools being applied are not responding to the underlying problem. And I fear we are not doing the being frank with ourselves here. I think there's too much invested in continuing what was started to say, pause and let's work through what might be more effective here. So the current moment really demands a lot of all actors in terms of better strategies.
Well, thank you very much, and I think we should thank our panelists for their wonderful contributions. So, thank you, Comfort, thank you, Karin, thank you, Thomas, thank you, Shivshankar, thank you, Funmi.